Thanks, Graham, and welcome everyone to today's webinar on how to manage a senior executive exit with a minimal business impact, where we'll look at how businesses can effectively manage the exiting of senior leaders and the transition of power whilst maintaining their brand reputation. So my name is Will Watts, and I'm the client director for the ICEO, which is LHH's practice providing strategic career advisory services to senior executives. And I'm joined by fantastic speakers today with a wealth of experience in the world of executive and board level transition. So we have Francis Cook, Managing Director of the ICEO, who's been looking after our Senior Directors Unit for almost 20 years, working closely with organizations on senior level exits, but also connecting leaders with expert help in progressing, developing and changing their careers. Frances was previously a PLC board member of Penna Group, where she held a number of senior roles and is currently a member of LHH's UK and Ireland executive team. Our second presenter is Louise Chaplin, who is Director and Head of Board Practice at Eton Bridge Partners, which is a leading executive search and interim management firm. And Louise supports chairs, CEOs and NEDs to attract the right key talent for their boards. And she serves as a council member for Europe and Africa for the Association of Executive Search Consultants, which is the leading industry body for the search and leadership advisory profession globally. So you're in very good hands today. Gary Browning, Chairman of Harvey Nash and board advisor, was scheduled to speak today, but unfortunately won't be able to make it. His father very sadly passed away over the weekend. So our thoughts are obviously with Gary, and no doubt he'll be part of other webinars we do in the future. Okay, so let me just kick things off by passing you over to Francis and Louise for reflections on 2020 and 2021.
Thank you very much, Will, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us all to talk about this topic of managing senior executive exits. It's a surprisingly complex topic, and I know it resonates with many of you, because what happens at the top of an organization is ultimately reflected throughout the entire organization. It's often reflected externally in the media. It's reflected with investors and advisors and with just about every stakeholder group, from employees to customers to clients and even suppliers. So it has a huge impact. The leadership of an organization and the way that that is viewed externally and internally has a huge impact on the way that a business runs and functions. And I remember Gary himself, whom I worked with in my PLC board days, and he indeed has been a chief executive and CEO himself before moving into the world of NED and advisory. And I remember him once saying, for every employee, the most important days of their time with us are their first day and their last day. And that's magnified enormously when you come to the most senior people in the organization. But before we come to the practical side of managing exits and the best way to handle that, we felt it was very sensible just to put into context in the current climate how this has changed during the pandemic, and why it makes it more important than ever to send the right messages from the top down. So, there's no doubt that all sectors, all markets, and ownership structures have changed throughout the pandemic. We've had to adapt rapidly to the way that we interact with customers and with clients. The organizations have had to think about the way they deliver services and goods, how they manage and motivate their workforces and ensure that they remain afloat and alive to enjoy, perhaps that's the wrong word, to face perhaps the post-pandemic world. And our world is changed now by many degrees, and no doubt will be so forever and will continue to do so at a rate of knots. And the speed that we've all had to learn to be adaptive, to be flexible, to be creative is remarkable. delivery of our own services at ICEO, for example, and in the world of executive search, which Louise is fronting, had to move from a very personal one-to-one perspective, meeting face-to-face on a regular and daily basis, to successful virtual delivery, within a matter of days. Somehow we did it, just as in the same way so many businesses, whether they were, selling insurance or retail outlets or whatever, have had to adapt and change. So I think perhaps, Louise, you might be best placed as head of board practice to put some more meat on the bones and to highlight some of the trends that have happened.
Frances, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this webinar this afternoon. It'd be a great pleasure to share reflections. I thought perhaps I would just give you a little reflection on my personal background, and because in preparation for this session today, when talking about reflections and the leadership style, etc., I must say there's some personal experience has been woven into this. So my early career was in the British Army. I served in Germany, Bosnia and Northern Ireland. Then I worked for Ashridge Business School, partly responsible for business development, but also on their leadership consulting team. And then 9 years ago, I joined Eton Bridge Partners, initially in the CFO and finance practice, and then set up the board practice 6 years ago. Sitting on the board at Eton Bridge, we're a 90-strong interim search firm based with 2 offices. We had to lead through the pandemic, like you all have done as well. And I suppose so some of the nuance of reflections is reflected in my own personal journey, but also the journey that I supported CEOs and other board members over the last 18 months. So I suppose to kick off with the impact of board hiring during the pandemic, as I'm sure you all recall, that moment when we abruptly went into lockdown, our world, particularly within the search and selection side, did grind to a halt. And I must say, I did personally reflect and think, well, how are we going to operate in a world where we can no longer even our liberty to go for a walk 3 times a day? We're allowed to go for a walk once a day. How are we going to operate as individuals, as search consultants, place people? How are people going to hire without meeting face to face? And of course, as Frances said, we adapted, and we adapted very, very quickly. However, the impact of the board hiring during the pandemic was initially board hiring stopped quite abruptly, as did a lot of exec hiring. After 6-8 weeks, it then started to continue to pick up, but not at the same pace. And the impact of that going forward meant that we look at recruitment, particularly board hiring, as a circular event, that there are always people coming on and off a board. If you stop the flow will just overflow over a period of time. So it's crucial to ensure that if there is a pause in events, the flow does continue. And we are seeing that starting now to pick up, but not perhaps as quickly as we expected. So boards and their structure really did freeze for a considerable period within 2020. And that was partly because of there was a real focus by chairs and investors to say, look, we have to support the exec team in leading through this event. Changes in the boardroom would not be helpful at the moment. Let's just keep the team as is, unless there are extenuating circumstances, and let's lead through this crisis. So there was a significant impact in the board hiring. Frances touched on blurring of sectors, and I would agree, and I would actually say that the statement is very, very relevant. Organisations now have a technology platform. And so sectors, and we saw sectors and the blurring of lines of sectors very prevalent within the searches we ran in 2020 and continue to do in 2021. And the sector lines have become greyer, but also what we've seen from a client demand perspective is organisations are interested in hearing experiences of leaders and board members of other sectors. So there is more sector diversity, and searches that we're mandated for now and see there is definite diversity across sectors becoming a very prevalent request. And then changes in the structure of the board and the exec team. I think I touched on that in terms of the boardroom being sort of frozen as such, unless extenuating circumstances. To the same extent, the exec team very much was a point where let's lead through this, and unless there is a real need to change, let's keep the exec team in place. So that, I suppose, that is a summary of 2020 and 2021. Chloe, can we move on to the next slide? Perfect. Thank you. So what is happening now? So what we've seen certainly at the start of 2021, was the strategy in the boardroom being set and agreed, and the execution of that now coming through. In the strategy setting, what was very evident was that board assessment and exec assessment was being taken place. And with that, individuals were, I suppose, assessed in their ability to lead in the new world, in the new strategy. And from that, there has been some shuffling around in terms of CEO and CFO hiring. And individuals, we've seen particular personal examples of individuals perhaps putting their hand up and saying, look, I'm not the best person to lead with this new strategy. I would like to step out. And this can be for a multitude of reasons. One individual, one CEO I supported said, Louise, I really need to find a new role. The business I did lead turned over $500 million and now turns over 50 million. You know, it's not in my skill set to be running a business of $500 million, 50 million. I need to get back into some sort of scale and complexity. Conversely, some businesses grew significantly, particularly SaaS platforms, and leaders were then left being quite challenged with the scale of growth and being able to cope with that complexity. So it's worked on both a growth and a restructuring perspective.
And Louise, I can indeed support you from that angle, from what we've seen with the people that we work with in ICEO, where, you know, as you say, a fundamental change in the business has led to a no-fit situation where somebody had then found themselves either wanting to move out or being moved out. But equally, spaces have been created for people from, as you say, different sectors or with different experiences, which suddenly look very relevant in what might have previously been an unheard of sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think thinking about, I think that moves us nicely onto sort of organizational restructuring and then that blending into investor activity. Obviously, organizations as a whole have had to restructure, redefine their purpose in some cases. And the impacts of COVID have been global, but the impact regionally has been different. And leaders of global businesses have had a real challenge on their hands in order to determine how do you restructure and set up your organization to effect change, both locally, but also globally. And then the investor activity, and we do a lot of work within the private equity environment. We support a lot of funds when they're looking to acquire organizations and invest in organizations. And we also support a lot of businesses that are within AIM and the FTSE and those privately owned businesses that are looking to list and looking to get that external investment. And that is certainly, and I think we're all aware, the busyness of the market in that, and how that can affect change both in the boardroom and for the C-suite. And I think certainly from an investor perspective, there is a huge expectation both on CEOs, CFOs and board members to deliver results, to deliver on exit plans, to deliver against the share price expectations. And that can be a real challenge, but it also in some markets can be a real positive, particularly in going back to the technology side, the SaaS platforms. There is hugely inspirational stories around growth of businesses and inspirational leaders. So I think at the moment what we're seeing is some good activity in the market. There's some good C-suite activity in the market, but that also, if you look at the flip side, when the CEO activity, there's also likely to be an exiting CEO, and it's how do organizations support the exit of individuals smoothly and eloquently to ensure both the business model is preserved, but also the people and the leadership model is preserved. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So market activity going forward and the impact of the global disruption. So I think I've touched a little bit around thinking globally and regionally in terms of organizational structures. And we've talked a little bit around the board devising the strategic direction. I think what's a real challenge for CEOs and the C-suite now is setting that strategic direction and executing it effectively to ensure that the people are joining you on the journey and the people are with you in the journey. And really making sure that the individuals involved within both the leadership team and C-1 and C-2 are able to have a voice, are be able to be heard about their impact on within that strategic change. Because the strategic change, and I think we've all been part of a business that has a strategic change in direction, it can feel a little unnerving. It can be, well, do I understand, what will happen the next year to 18 months? So I think it's around communication and leadership style is so important to make sure that that change in strategic direction is effective. And that comes from the leadership down and from the boardroom ultimately. The divestment and acquisitions, increasing and decreasing in business size. Now, I think from that perspective, as I touched on with the PE market and the activity and the funds available to invest for PE funds to invest in the market, I think there's a huge amount of activity and there's a huge amount of carve-out activity. And that again creates opportunity, but also creates uncertainty in the market, particularly at a personal level. And I think in terms of the thinking about the CEOs and the board members and their journey through the pandemic, what I used to talk about last year, and it's a delight not to have to dwell on it so much this year, was around the self-selection within the C-suite. So there were opportunities created through individuals looking at the role, looking at the strategic direction ahead and thinking, am I right for this organization going forward? I'm going to put my hand up and go, actually, no, my skill set is not aligned with the strategic direction. I'm going to self-select. There are other individuals that put their hand up and said, I'm really finding this is a tough call going forward. I've been working at this business for the last 15 years. I can see what's ahead of me. I'm going to self-select. And then there was the latter was around, actually the board felt that the individual, the leader, the CEO, the CFO was not fit in terms from their perspective to lead the business from their expertise and background, that they were probably more suited to a growth environment rather than restructuring, and that they were exited. So there was always three buckets of opportunity. But it was quite interesting that the 2 out of the 3, 66% was self-selection through the individual, and only a third was by the organisation. The organisations really wanted to hold on to individuals, particularly during the pandemic. Frances?
Yeah, no, indeed. And, what we often find, because very often we will begin work with people thinking about their career even before their exit is acknowledged and publicly announced. And that is for all the reasons that Louise is talking about, is it becomes apparent that change is required in the boardroom or in the senior executive level. People realize it for themselves because they are part of that transformation, they're part of those meetings, they're part of that adaptivity that's going on. And therefore, they are conscious that this is not necessarily the right way forward for them, and more importantly for their company. And contrary to public opinion, sometimes actually, the C-suite and the senior team do care enormously about the organisations with whom they work and about their future, and want to see the best for them. So, yeah, very, very much an ongoing trend at the moment.
Great. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So thinking about what's happening with leadership in the world today, and I think there's threads coming through, and I think we'll probably find we all have this in our everyday discussions around the rapid change of operating models. I mean, Francis touched on it right in the beginning. We all went from walking to the office, traveling to the office, to staying at home. So our personal operating models and how we deliver and execute our personal roles changed in an instant. I think looking at the NHS, looking at supply chain, all those elements created huge amounts of change across the world, not just obviously in the UK. And it's now the discussion, and there are very regular webinars around the future of work. And a lot of the time it's around the physicality of the work, as in where are we going to work from, and sometimes about flexible ways of work. However, I think the change is going to be far more fundamental in terms of leadership styles, the challenge of leading Generation Z, Generation X, the new generations coming through. What does that mean? What do they want? And ESG and the social element of ESG, we are seeing increasingly that individuals want to understand the purpose of the business. They want to understand around the giving back agenda. They want to be part of a business that has a clear purpose in the market, so that they feel part of a community as well as a workforce. And I think that as a leadership challenge going forward is a challenge for anybody in a leadership position, anybody in a C-suite or a boardroom. And then I think there's been fundamental changes to the, I suppose, employer-employee relationship, and it moves away from very much the authoritarian leadership style that we've seen that transition over the last sort of 10, 15 years to empowering individuals, giving individuals the sense of space to be able to deliver, both in virtually, but also, in a return to work, but also being able to support individuals in their journey. And how do you do that in a virtual environment? Certainly within the Eton Bridge perspective, we grew 25% over the last 12 months. So we've had 21 new employees that we have onboarded since June last year. And our model traditionally has been a very traditional one, good open plan office, learning by sitting beside senior members of the team, be able to engage on a one-to-one basis, and learning, as I call it, ambient learning in the workplace. We've had to adapt our styles quite significantly to be able to support individuals coming in, whether they're coming in as a researcher or coming in as a partner. How do you impart that knowledge and how do you impart that learning going forward? And that is a real challenge for any leader in any business, the ambient learning in the workplace. Francis, I'm sure you've seen good examples of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just to support that, both from our own perspective at LHH and ICEO, where we have had the same thing, the number of new employees coming on board and at senior level who we never had a chance to meet in person in recruitment. But what's also been important is that for our clients, those who are looking for new roles or setting up new businesses or developing completely new purposes, many of them have gone through the process in the last year or so from start to finish without either meeting us in person or their ultimate employer in person. So, some of the questions, some of the interview styles, some of the ways of selecting new senior people in your organization had been adapted significantly to ensure that that person will be a cultural fit, and also, more importantly, will have the ability to manage people remotely as well as and those people are not just the people in the organization, but to manage the external relationships, which we'll talk about in a minute, you know, with advisors and investors and with, you know, with auditors or whatever, you know, how one learns to be able to do that effectively without ever being face to face. And whilst we're not going to remain that way forever, we're certainly likely to be, I'm really hating the hybrid word and I'm just about to use it. We're certainly about to be operating in many different ways, which will include remote as well as face-to-face.
Great, and I think there's been some recent research done with by My Kind of Future, and it suggests that 30% of employees still feel a sense of belonging and connectivity to their current organisation. But and that's relatively low, I think, in terms of if you'd had that stat before the pandemic. Concerningly, I think 80% would consider a job move in the next 12 months. So it's really, really interesting how, as leaders of businesses going forward, how do you engage your style and how do you get that engagement at all levels within the organisation? I had the pleasure of speaking to a CEO of a FTSE 350 at the latter part of last year, and I said, you know, just thinking back and take yourself back to March, and you know, what changed for you in March, April, May? And he said, Louise, I realised we're a people business. I had 5,000 people globally. My role changed from being externally facing and looking at clients and looking at external advisors. I realised that the power of the business was in the people, and I turned to internal leadership and leading from the front and making sure that all our employees were fully engaged and felt fully supported. And I think that brings back, there's been quite a gulf of organisations that have perhaps reacted very well to the pandemic from an employee support perspective. And there's been others quite visible examples where perhaps employees have felt more remote and more distant. And that's going to be an interesting journey for us all going forward as to how do we manage that. And as Francis said, in the hybrid world, which we're not that practiced yet at because we're just starting, how do we manage that hybrid relationship of the balance of working from home, and now individuals do have the opportunity to come back to the office? How is that managed? And I think that brings us nicely onto the board and the investors reassessing the needs of the leadership team. And there's twofold to this, I think, and certainly within the boardroom at the beginning, when I was speaking to chairs and non-execs, there was a lot of them used to get on the screen and I said, gosh, look a little tired, I've been working hard. He said, I've never been so much in demand from my portfolio than over the last 12 months, because obviously the pace of change was so fast. There was in some organisations, daily board updates, weekly board meetings, cash flow updates. Now going forward into the new world, it is understanding what is the need of the leadership team from the board and getting the boundaries reset. Because I think that quite rightly during the pandemic, all board members were very accessible. I think the boundaries probably need to be reset a little bit in some places to understand, okay, let's get back into the cycle of monthly board meetings. But also then what does that mean from a leadership perspective? How well are the execs being supported to lead in this new environment, particularly in a lot of the situations with a new strategy, with a new target operating model, and perhaps a new team sitting underneath them. So what is the balance there? And that can be from both a chair investor perspective, but from a CEO perspective, that requires leadership with strong emotional intelligence, a clear understanding of your purpose, and also that drive and enthusiasm to continue the momentum of the business in the right direction. So I think it's really interesting in terms of that dynamic and what we're looking for in leaders and how they perform both in a, as I call it, 2D environment as well as a environment. We're all getting very practiced at 2D. but how do you go back to being 3D? And is it it's a natural evolution for some, but others have to work at it. And we all have to be mindful that people have their own set styles, and some people adapt well to a virtual environment, and some people love being back in the office. And it's making sure that all of those styles are embraced and individuals are encouraged to maybe blend their styles so that they get a good balance between 2D and 3D. Frances, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's interesting. Those of you who are observant will probably notice that both Louise and I are sat in our offices today, and I'm sat alongside other members of my team, and certainly we're finding that you know, we now know we can all do what we do remotely. You know, we've all adapted, and you know, most of us have survived. You know, most businesses, whether it's been a call center selling insurance, or a car factory, or whatever, have survived and adapted to this new way of working. But it is becoming clearer that there is no substitute for the ambient learning that Louise talked about, but also for, you know, really getting the feel for an operating model, for a way a business runs. And you know, very definitely, it's going to be an interesting journey, and we'll have to learn all over again how to be 3D people, not just screen-based people, which will be a relief for me, being a bit of a technophobe.
And I suppose the last point I was going to highlight on this slide, and then I'll hand across to you, Frances, just around senior execs and their Damascus moments. And I think particularly senior execs with a global responsibility. There's been a number of people, and certainly Gary and I both have seen this, and both have supported individuals in this situation where they were on 100 flights a year or 200 flights a year, and they were lifetime gold card members, and they suddenly went from that to being at home every day, and they were able to reflect, and they were able to go, I need to get the balance right going forward. And they would needed to understand the priorities, not only for themselves, but also for their team, and their demands they put on their team going forward. So I think when we talk about Damascus moments, from a work-life balance perspective, both from an individual and organizational side, a lot of good will come out of the pandemic. And I think individuals and organizations are much more reflective and should be more balanced in their view going forward around the challenges of putting the demands of, if you've got a region of Southeast Asia and you've got EMEA, how do you manage that both geographically from a travel perspective, but also if you're sitting at home and managing Zoom calls all day, how is that managed effectively as well? Because, you know, we've seen consistently, both in the press and I know we'll all have examples of this around individuals feeling burnt out, individuals being burnt out, and being able to either come back or make those difficult decisions at the time that actually life is important and the balance is very important. And I think we've all got to be mindful of that as we come back into the 3D environment as well.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Louise. And I know you'll have some comments to make whilst we're talking over on the next slide about you know, actually making successful leadership transitions. So let's start perhaps by thinking about, you know, why it is so important. What is it about senior leaders and, you know, senior level people that makes it even more important to handle exits well? That's not to say that for everyone else in our organization, it isn't just as important to make sure that they are taken care of when they leave us, you know, remembering that point I made at the beginning about the last day and the first day. But the impact of getting it wrong at very senior level can be massive. You know, let's just start by thinking about the high profile of the individuals that we would be working with here at ICEO, and you know, the level of connection that they have, both internally and externally, from the organisation. So, you know, they're likely to have connections with everybody, from investors, and we'll talk about them in particular in a moment, to advisors, to PR and reputation managers, to strategic consultants, to suppliers, you know, major supply agreements, customers, and even the media. You know, many of them will have a personality, and I don't just mean the leaders of big companies, but you know, with the diversity of you know, high touch startups with, you know, technology concepts, etc. You know, you find that senior people are in the public eye, or in the wider eye, and particularly through social media, etc. So, you know, there's a huge amount of influence, and therefore, if these people are not exited well, or perhaps they're, you know, their public feel that they've been unfairly treated, or their wider audience, then, you know, this can have major impacts, and you know, it can also result in difficulty in hiring for the future, as we'll come back to in a moment. So, you know, thinking about the investor angle, for example, you know, senior leaders are seen as the value add. They're setting the strategy and the course, and you know, they're developing the business plans, and they're also ensuring that risks are managed. And risks are not just about financial risk, but exposure to operational risk. I mean, if you think, just last night we had 6 hours, or almost 6 hours, I understand, of no Facebook, no WhatsApp, no Instagram. You know, the repercussions from that in terms of the value of the organisation, which apparently dropped by 5% at one point, just due to an operational risk that had not been sufficiently underpinned. And one wonders, will heads roll from that particular organisation? So, you know, you've got to think about the view of the investor of an organisation, and, you know, whether they will be exposed to reputation damage if they're seen to be backing organisations that are not performing for whatever reason. Also, investors will be really aware of reputation damage as well, and, you know, perhaps accusations of organisations utilising, you know, slave labour, or poor pay and conditions, or, you know, outsourcing overseas. Remember Boohoo, and you know, the scenario there when it was exposed that that they were perhaps, you know, senior management perhaps not as you know, as diligent as they could be in understanding how they achieved their margins and achieved their external viewpoint. So, you know, really important to bear that in mind. Likewise, if a member of senior leadership team, and we're not always talking C-suite here, because organisations are complex and many layered. Even smaller organisations will have degrees of influential senior employees. If their fan base, if their fellow colleagues feel they've been badly treated, that can have an enormous impact on the employee. It can lead to accusations of blame culture, and who takes the blame, and why they are exited, and whether it's the right person. Again, I remember another saying from Gary's time, which was, you know, there's trouble at the top, deputy heads will roll. So you often find it's not the CEO that is that's being exited. It may be the CFO or the COO, or, you know, that next level of direct report coming in. So, you know, it's really important to manage exits fairly, and settlements seem fair, and not a reward for failure, but also knowing when and where to implement and how to support the departing executives to stop the shock waves, and, you know, take decisive action clearly, but also in a compassionate and fair manner. And you also have to think about the external matters of having to, for example, inform a stock exchange or a regulator of a departure. People may be a statutory director, and again, how that is all handled and the speed and smoothness of how that is handled will impact on how that person's exit is viewed. We also need to think about exit in relation to restructure and transformation. And I think both Louise and I touched on this earlier, that it's often the changing nature of a business or a marketplace or a customer base, which means that we no longer need a senior person. It's not necessarily due to their level of performance or any, as I said earlier, any blame, but it's simply that a different person is required with a different set of skills and talent. And again, managing that with dignity and fairness is hugely important. I think the fallout from changes at the top, whether they're voluntary or involuntary, we have to be in control of those, and we have to have a clear procedure, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Because without the right reaction from our employees and the external base, it can be very difficult to attract future talent. It can be difficult to retain talent that you already have, because they think, well, if it happened to her, it could happen to me. Or, well, I don't really like the way the culture of the organization looks now. They're getting rid of all the people who used to do X. And that can have a huge impact on the business and the momentum. And likewise, as I mentioned earlier, because of the relationships that our senior people have with with external people like suppliers, for example, like our perhaps logistics providers, all the things we might outsource, that too can have a reaction on in terms of how the business maintains its performance and momentum. And sometimes if people fundamentally disagree with the way an organization is being run, and therefore perhaps how things are managed at exit, they may decide that this is not the kind of organization that they want to work with, or with whom they supply. Louise, I'm sure you find sometimes that when you're looking to fill a position, people will question just that sort of stuff.
Absolutely, and I think it is, when we go through the briefing process and are supporting that boardroom, there's quite a lot of time spent in terms of the current situation. How are you going to transition the current CEO out of the organization? Is he or she being supported at the moment? Does he or she know what's going on? Is it going to be a surprise? Is it going to be a surprise? Sometimes, just due to the nature of the sensitivity and the market involvement, it can be quite severe in terms of, we will run a search in a completely confidential environment, make an appointment. The individual will be informed on the Friday, and the announcement to the market will go out on the Monday with a direct replacement. I never feel that that is an ideal approach, but obviously sometimes the board feels that that is the most appropriate way to support the business going forward, and ultimately the business needs. But we spend a lot of time understanding that, and it gives us insight as well. And good candidates always ask me, well, tell me about the current situation, Louise, and what are they doing, and how are they going to support that individual? Because it gives me an insight in terms of the culture of the business, both from a boardroom, but also from a wider people perspective, how they're going to support him or her coming into that environment. And exits can be like onboarding. If you can be onboarded very quickly, but you can be exited very quickly. So it gives all organizations a really good, it gives individuals a good understanding of how an organization operates.
Yeah, And I think we also have to bear in mind, we keep talking about businesses and organizations, but all of the things that we're talking about, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment in terms of practicalities, also apply to everyone from a charity through to the public sector, through to government, through to the education sector, or whatever it might be. Just because they maybe don't have the same investor reaction does not mean they don't have the same public profile. So again, many people will remember how there have been, unfortunately, some high-profile exits in the charitable world, due to mismanagement or reputational damage of a personal nature. And then that charity suffers enormously in terms of the donations it gets, or the subsidies it gets from government, etc. So we have to think right across the board, and indeed at ICEO, we're delighted to work with people from every sort of sector. And just because it's not a traditional business ownership structure doesn't mean that that the same thoughts and care should not go into it. And I think I saw among the delegate list, which I was perusing earlier, that there are attendees from various sectors here. I always remember once being briefed by an organisation in the public eye about a person they were going to put into our care. And I was called down to the offices and given the briefing. And then I was given a finger wagging warning. And they said, "And finally, Frances, we don't want any Daily Mail moments." And apologies to those who are Daily Mail readers, which include me on Thursdays and Mondays with the women's section. But you can see really what we're saying is that reputational risk can, have huge impact no matter who you are and where you are and what it is that you're doing. So no one is exempt from the pressures of doing it and doing it well. So let's have a think then, and I won't go into too much detail because I think it's there's plenty of time to follow up then and to have questions about how do you do things well. And I'd firstly start by the recap of saying that very rarely are these situations performance related. The single most common reason for senior change is actually change of CEO at the top. Invariably when a new CEO comes in, they want to bring in their own team. But there are so many reasons why people are leaving, and all of them should deserve a dignified exit. One of the things that's been talked about for years and is only really just happening is that pre-planning in terms of contractual obligations and potential settlements. So in other words, planning for the end at the beginning is really important. It should be clear when, and I know Louise will support this and maybe wish to comment in a moment, it's really important at the beginning when you're hiring people that they know what is expected of them, what the procedures and practices are, but also what will happen in the event that they leave you, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And that obviously needs to cover everything from competitive restraint through to public communication, and confidentiality. It needs to cover what help they might get from people like ourselves in resettlement, what the financial terms might be, and every single angle of that you need to think about really should be in that contract from the beginning, because that's when people get caught. And the other thing you have to bear in mind is that very often the individuals who are involved in the exit and having to communicate the exit to the individual or individuals are less senior to them and maybe even report to them. So therefore, it's doubly important that things should be watertight and cover every angle. So I would implore those of you who are involved in this area, or those of you who have control of this area, to really start giving that some thought. Don't leave it till, it should be a matter of course as a human resources or a CHRO priority to know what happens to people on their last day as well as their first day. And that includes things, as I say, like garden leave. One thing, again, that you need to really think about in terms of getting it right and getting it wrong is also timing. It's surprising how many people decide to make changes or decide to seize the moment just before a major business pitch, or just as a supplier contract is up for renewal, or just after an acquisition has been made, at which or a new strategy has been developed, which this person has been instrumental in being part of, and then all of a sudden, that it's decided that they're not needed. So, strategically, you need to be very clear about the timing and the way that you do it. You need to be clear about the legal advice that they should seek, and that they should be encouraged to seek it, because no one wants a public mess. But it's surprising how, however big and smart senior leaders are, the anger and the emotion that can be triggered in these situations, even if they're expected, even if they maybe, have known in the back of their mind that this could and may happen, can often lead to some quite difficult situations. And probably one of the roles that we very often perform is talking people down from the ceiling as a neutral advisor. Again, an angry individual is not the best person to be going out seeking a new role. It's they're not doing themselves any favor, but they're certainly not doing yours. You need to think about what's going to happen physically in terms of the timing of them leaving the organization. At senior level, people often leave quite quickly because it's kind of messy to have them around. But again, you need to be clear on that and to have thought that through before you start having the conversations. And you need to make sure that that they are offered support from people like ourselves in going forward, and also that they see this as a mark of respect and a mark of their value. I had two very different conversations about 3 months ago with two CHROs, one of whom was securing our highest level of services for her departing CEO, who had been with the business actually for 30 years, and then had succeeded as CEO about 9 years ago. And as a result of a strategy he had himself pursued through acquisition and growth, then found himself, not needing the role. She was very aware that with the sort of package she was getting and the sort of service they wanted to offer from us, that this would have to be Remco approved. And I remember her words to me, and I thought, if I had a CHRO in my organisation, I'd want to hear these words. She said, "I will fight tooth and nail," and it was a he, to ensure he gets this and he gets the package he's deserved. He's given us 30 years of his life. He's given up personal time. He's devoted his time to our organisation, and we want him to go knowing he was and is valued. He will be a happy alumnus and a goal, a goal for people to look up to. A second scenario, actually with a COO from the same sector, and a conversation I was having. The organisation said, "Well, you know what? Actually, we're giving him a lot of money, so and he's going away with his rewards and his share options and all the rest of it. So we're just going to let him sort himself out, Francis. So he can come and talk to you, but he'll have to pay for it himself, and it's up to him, where he goes and what he does in the future." And that level of carelessness can result in a massive internal reaction, as we've said, but also an external relation. Needless to say, actually, the individual did decide to take up our services and work with us. Again, it was a himself, but 4 of his colleagues have followed. And I don't think that any of them, the organisation wanted to lose any of those. But they felt, well, if this is how someone is treated, then we're not going to stay around in this sort of organisation. So that's those angles. The other angles are communication. What are you going to say? When are you going to say it? And to whom are you going to say it? And that means, again, internally and externally. And how are you going to make sure you don't want to gag the senior person who's going, but equally you need to make sure that you're all on the same page, and that an exit is dignified and compassionate. So the management of reputation, externally and internally, the communication in order to ensure that individuals are perceived to be fairly treated, it is absolutely of huge importance. So I guess what I'm saying is that, if you're looking for people with, who'll have happy alumni, who'll be happy alumni, who'll have good landings externally elsewhere in the market, or doing their own thing, or setting up their own business, or even retiring in the broadest sense of word. If you're looking for an orderly transition, and you're looking to retain the key players you want to retain in the organisation, as well as attracting new talent in the future, then it really pays to get this right and to give it the thought and the depth of consideration that it demands. Because, in the light of the last 18 months, I think it's just more and more important to manage exits with dignity, with compassion, and with fairness. It's what we all want for others, and I think senior leaders want for themselves. So on that note, I'll leave it open for questions in terms of some of the practical aspects. Or Louise, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add at this stage.
No, I think your points around the communication and the individuals, and we sometimes see individuals that I would say sort of land in my virtual lobby having had quite a swift exit and not much support around them. It's amazing the impact it has, not only on that individual, his wider personal network, his business network, and also that impact that he will take forward going into his next role, but also if we were to hire for that business, the hiring strategy. So I think it is that support on exit, even if perhaps funds are not available for a full fat version of support, it is the gesture and the offer of support. It's not always financial, the levers. It's much more around support driven.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise and Francis. I am conscious of time, having about 30 seconds left. So just time to say thanks so much to everyone for joining today's webinar. Really hope you found the content useful and enjoyed the discussion. And if you are interested in we're very happy to have a follow-up conversation on any of the topics raised, and maybe discuss any specific senior transitions within your own organisations. So do let me know, or even let your LHH key contact know if you'd like to chat.
And I think, if there are any questions, I know we haven't really had time for any, then please do send them in, and we'll be very happy to reply by email if you like, or whatever suitable medium.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Louise, Francis, and thanks to everybody for joining. Have a nice evening.
Well, thank you.